Have you ever driven by an abandoned house and wondered what happened there? Maybe it was the way the paint had chipped away, or the windows were boarded up, or perhaps it was just the eerie quiet that seemed to surround the place. For me, that house was the one on Sycamore Hill, a place I'd always heard about, but never paid much attention to, until I moved back to my hometown last year. I grew up in a small, sleepy town where not much ever happened. Everyone knew each other, and the most exciting news was when the diner got a new special on the menu. After college, I moved away to the city for work, but when my mother passed, I decided to come back. The house on Sycamore Hill was just another part of the town's scenery, the kind of place kids told stories about to scare one another. It had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, and most people avoided it. They said it was cursed. Of course, I never believed in curses. Ghosts, haunted houses, all that stuff seemed like stories for kids, but there was something about that house. Every time I passed by, it felt like it was watching me, waiting. It was a ridiculous thought, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The house was perched on top of a small hill, overlooking the town. Its paint had long faded, and the shutters hung loosely from rusted hinges. The yard was overgrown with weeds and tall grass, and the whole place looked like it had been forgotten by time. There was something unnerving about the way it sat there, untouched, as if waiting for something, or someone. I was staying at my childhood home, sorting through my mother's things. It was a sad, lonely task, but it gave me time to reflect on everything. After a week of going through old photo albums and letters, I needed a break. That's when I made the decision to finally check out the house on Sycamore Hill. It was a Saturday afternoon when I drove up there, the sky overcast with the threat of rain. As I pulled up to the property, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just silence. The house seemed even more imposing up close, its windows dark and empty. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I told myself it was just nerves. After all, it was just an old house, right? I stepped out of the car and made my way to the front door. The porch creaked under my weight, and the air smelled musty like old wood and decay. The front door was slightly ajar, and with a gentle push it opened with a groan. The inside of the house was dark, and my footsteps echoed as I walked inside. It was like stepping into a time capsule. The furniture was still there, covered in dust and cobwebs, as if the family had just left one day and never returned. Old photos lined the walls, their faces faded and unrecognizable. There was an eerie stillness to the place, a sense that I wasn't alone even though I knew I was. As I explored the house, I found myself drawn to the second floor. The stairs were steep and creaked with each step, and by the time I reached the top, I was sure I could hear something, faint but there, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from one of the rooms down the hall. I hesitated, but something compelled me to keep going. The hall was narrow, and the air felt colder up there, heavier. The door to the room was closed, and the tapping had stopped. I reached for the doorknob, and just as my fingers touched the cold metal, I heard it again, a faint whisper, just on the other side of the door. "Help me!" I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. It was impossible. There was no one in the house. I knew that, and yet I had heard it, clear as day. I pulled my hand back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't. Something about that voice, that plea for help, kept me rooted in place. Slowly, I turned the doorknob and pushed the doorknob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Just an old bed, a dresser, and a window with broken shutters. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the dim light coming through the window. But the room wasn't what bothered me. It was the mirror. There, on the wall opposite the bed, hung a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was old, intricately carved, and the glass was cracked, but I could still see my reflection clearly. As I stepped closer, something caught my eye. There was something in the reflection that wasn't in the room.
It was faint at first, just a shadow, but as I got closer, I could see it more clearly. A figure standing in the corner of the room, just out of sight. My heart raced as I whipped around, expecting to see someone there, but the room was empty.
I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, watching me from the corner. It was a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She opened her mouth, and though no sound came out, I could hear her words. "Help me." I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But there she was, trapped in the reflection, her eyes pleading with me.
Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, my heart pounding as I spun around, my eyes darting to the door. It was closed tight, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the hall.
I ran to the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My hands were shaking as I pounded on the door, desperate to get out. And then the footsteps stopped. I pressed my ear to the door, listening, my breath shallow. The silence was deafening, and I could feel my pulse racing in my throat. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the room. I turned back to the mirror, and the woman was gone. The glass was cracked, shards falling to the floor as the frame began to shake violently. The room was freezing now, my breath visible in the air. I could hear whispers all around me, faint but growing louder, like a chorus of voices calling out in desperation. They echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. "Help us." I backed away from the mirror, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. It was just an old house, an empty, abandoned house. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They filled the room, growing louder, more frantic. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I ran to the window, hoping to climb out, but when I looked outside, the yard was gone. In its place was a vast, endless void, dark and empty. The sky was black, no stars, no moon, just a gaping nothingness stretching out as far as I could see. Panic surged through me as I turned back to the door, pounding on it with all my strength. The whispers were deafening now, the voices overlapping, pleading with me to help them, to free them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The air grew still, and the room fell into an eerie silence. I stood there, trembling, unsure of what had just happened. The mirror was still there, cracked but no longer shaking. The room was just as it had been when I entered, as if nothing had happened. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I found the strength to open the door. It creaked open easily, as if it had never been stuck. I ran down the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until I reached my car. I never went back to the house on Sycamore Hill. I couldn't. I don't know what I saw in that room, or who that woman was, but I can still hear her voice sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the wind is still. "Help me." And every time I hear it, I wonder if I made a mistake. If I should have stayed. If maybe, just maybe, I could have helped her.